Okay, good evening or good morning whenever you are viewing this. This is my research activity for EW 6320. The article I chose for this project was the functional analysis and treatment of elopement across two school settings. I got that from the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis. Why elopement? Kind of obvious reasons here. It can interrupt the learning for the student eloping. It can impede the learning of the other students in the classroom. I've seen it lock down schools. It poses obvious dangers for the child and also possibly for the staff. Elopement can occur with any student. It does not necessarily have to be a student with a disability in a self-contained classroom. Teachers will often ask, how do I handle this? Do I leave my class and chase the student? Do I do an all call over the intercom? Is it possible to ignore the student leaving the classroom? But most importantly, teachers and parents alike will ask, how can I prevent this from happening in the future? So the purpose of this study was to determine practical and effective interventions against elopement. More specifically, this particular study looked to the influence of setting on the analysis and treatment of elopement. Most students, even those with disabilities, do not spend all day in one class setting, so it's important to understand how different places in the school can affect the level of elopement the student shows. The participant in this study was Joe. He was a 4-year-old male who was diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome. Uh, During the sessions, a therapist and one or two data collectors were present in the classroom. Also, the classroom had a couple of teachers present. The direct variable for this study was elopement, which was defined as getting out of seat, turning away from the therapist, and running towards the door of the room. The independent variables were twofold. They had an attention-based intervention and a tangible-based intervention. I'll explain that a little more here in just a second. An alternating treatment design was used, and a reversal design was used to determine the settings. These are the results. I'll be kind of clicking back and forth on the graph here in just a second, but you can see here, this is the baseline. We have our two settings, the resource room and the classroom. The whited out squares represent the attention-based treatment, and the filled in squares are the tangible-based treatment. The study concluded that in certain settings, certain interventions have a desired effect. In the resource room setting, the attention-based intervention yielded lower levels of elopement when compared to tangible-based interventions. So if we go back and look at the resource room, we can see that when the tangible-based intervention was implemented, we saw higher levels of elopement, but then when we did the attention-based treatment, we saw lower levels. The opposite was true in the classroom. We saw that when the tangible-based treatment was introduced, lower levels occurred, and then when the attention-based was introduced, we saw higher levels. Also, it's important to note that a functional analysis was used before the interventions to determine what interventions they were going to use in different settings. Let me go back real quick. The tangible based, what they did with that was the student Joe, he had a DVD player that they would place in his line of sight, and it would play throughout instruction. The volume was turned down so it didn't disrupt the other students. And we see that when he had access to that resource room, we saw higher levels of elopement. It wasn't that effective. But when we saw it in the classroom, when there were other students present, it had much more effect. The attention-based treatment was just giving him very positive praise throughout the session, staying close proximity throughout the session, basically focusing on Joe 100%, not taking their eyes off of him, every 5 seconds giving him a compliment, patting him on the back, physical contact, things like that. And when it was in the resource room, which was kind of more of a one-on-one setting, we saw a lot lower level of elopement. But then in the classroom, perhaps because there were more students present, we saw a much higher level of elopement. So for the critique, the study yielded results that could translate into the everyday classroom. Elopement can have many functions that does not necessarily translate to all settings. Some problems I found with this study, or the kind of obvious one, is it's not possible to ignore such a dangerous behavior, at least completely. Joe runs out of the room, we obviously can't just let him go. We either have to follow closely, redirect him back. We have to put the safety first of the students. So therefore, some attention has to be given. So even in the tangible based intervention, you're still giving attention to the student, whether that be intentional or not. It can still skew the data somewhat. To improve this study moving forward, it may prove beneficial to not only look at different settings, but to also look at who is giving the intervention. I know when I worked in a self-contained classroom, especially my boys, they worked fine with my female assistant, but when it came to me, they would like to take off and run. And oftentimes the opposite would prove true with the females. The female students would work just fine for me, but when they would sit down at the table with my female assistant, they would take off and run. So I would also look at who is giving the intervention and does that have any effect on the level of elopement. Moving forward, my research question was based on elopement, just because it's something I'm very familiar with teaching over the years. But I would like to look at it from a little different angle. I would still like to focus on the settings, but move beyond the school. Does it happen more at home? Does it happen more at the store? And what are some interventions that we could use that don't just work at school, but also work at home, working at Walmart, across a wide variety of settings. So that's what I would like to do moving forward, just because it's something that interests me. These are the references for the article. And I appreciate you listening, and I hope you have a great day. Thanks.